delay, but thank you, Rahul sir, for inviting me, and thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to talk about something which is important, which is research ethics as well as academic honesty and integrity. This is something very important these days when research is in the forefront in the academics. So I just want to put out a disclaimer out here. Whatever I'm going to present is based on my personal research experience, and your practices and approaches will vary. So please exercise your judgment regarding whatever is the suitability of this content. Of course, there are some things which are a complete no-no. You don't need any judgment there. But some part of it which I'll be presenting is mostly based on my personal experience. Uh, so whenever we get into research as well as academics, it's a big landscape, especially for beginners. So it's very important to navigate through this path, you know, with a lot of integrity. Uh, I'll focus more on PhD researchers rather than faculty members. This journey is very complex because we need to publish, we need to go through coursework, and there's a lot of pressure from let's say the guide as well as your completion process. So this process entirely becomes very complex, and with each step that you take, the entire landscape is evolving. And we learn new things as we progress. So things don't remain the same. Let's say in the first year when we join, compared to in the last year of the doctoral study, things are absolutely different. So the steps that we need to take are completely different in all this process and path and route. The ethics as well as the integrity needs to be maintained. So that is the focus of what I'm going to be presenting in this session. So it is very important for all of us. Again, I'll be focusing only on the research aspect. Very important for all of us to understand these ideas, principles, what are the responsibilities, so that we are able to conduct this research with a lot of ethics, and at the same time maintain as high standards of integrity as possible. So this applies to the faculty as well, but my focus will not be much on the faculty aspect. It's more on the PhD researcher aspect. So what basically are research ethics? So you'll find a lot of content online on ethics, and different universities are also define their own ethics. So in a nutshell, to summarize, it's basically all the moral principles and specific guidelines which will help us in conducting the research in a way that we are not harming any human participant if any animals are involved, as well as the data which we are dealing with remains confidential as well as sensitive. So with all of this and the principles, we need to follow these guidelines. So different universities have their own guidelines. I'll be talking about or summarizing the most important ones as we proceed. So as a summary, from most of the top universities, these ethics uh, basically involve respecting the rights of the researchers, maintaining their dignity, also ensuring that in the society everybody is well-being, and the researchers who are involved are also not exploited, is the word that mostly people used. And in all this process, we are able to advance the knowledge as well as the research works for the society. So as a PhD researcher, we always hear that our research needs to be cited and used by other researchers. So basically it means that the knowledge needs to improve, and our research needs to be used by other people. So this can only be done if uh, there is advancement from our research, and this follows this is possible if you have proper ethics and integrity there. So why are these ethics so important? Why are we talking about these ethics? So one can say these are specific rules and regulations And as I've already mentioned, you need to uphold the honesty, integrity, and the respect. But is it only these things, or is there more to research ethics than only this thing? So, of course, the moment we talk about research ethics, people talk about the usual copy paste, but there is much more than that in terms of research ethics. So, those of us who let's say, let me take an example. Those of us who submit to specific journals, at the end of the journal, we need to give statements and declarations, and there you will have some points on data, availability and conflict of interest, and those kind of points. Different publishers have different points. All those are part of research ethics. If some of you are uh, you know aware of the open access procedure, where before an article is being published, we are already posting it on different repositories like archive. There also we follow a lot of research ethics in terms of licenses. So I will touch upon those points as we go ahead. So what I'm trying to say here is research ethics is just not about certain points of honesty, integrity, and respect. It's much more than that. So, what can we get from ensuring that these principles and the rules are being followed? The most important is that we are able to protect the rights and the well-being of the participant. So, we are not basically harming anybody involved, the researchers who are involved, and also not exploiting them. This is something that we listen to and hear about, almost every day now, where there are a lot of research scholars or researchers who say that they've been exploited for various reasons. I'll not be pinpointing on any particular incident, but this is something which is very common. So if you're really active on platforms like LinkedIn, you will come across stories where there's a lot of exploitation going on in terms of researchers. So by going through or following these research ethics, we can ensure that we are able to minimize these exploitations for the researchers. Next is, of course, to maintain the integrity of research, the high quality. This is again something which a lot of universities and a lot of supervisors and students are talking about, quality versus the quantity. So, of course, anyone will tell you that we should focus more on the quality rather than just the quantity. Therefore, different universities now have different norms in terms of their publications. So, just as an example, different universities follow the quartiles where you have to go with Q1 or Q2. Then there are uh, uh, institutes where transactions are mandatory. So with this, you are able to maintain the quality, according to the university. This also ensures something very important, that the results or the findings from your research, they remain valid as well as reliable. So so that people are able to use those results, and therefore the research gets extended in literature rather than just another article or another white paper, for example, just being published and lying around. So that is something that you don't want. So the research has to be reliable, as well as the results have to be valid from that research. Next is following up from the previous point. If over the course of time a researcher is able to validate and provide reliable findings, then as we say that his research CV grows, and therefore in the research community you are able to build trust as well as credibility. So people see this work, and they are able to understand that by following this researcher or following the research work of this researcher or his group, you are able to get good results, and then you are able to extend your own research based on the studies which this researcher has conducted. So point number 2 and 3 are basically followed up, they follow each other. So unless and until we have validity and reliability of the research findings, it's very difficult to build trust as well as credibility. So they go hand in hand. Next, I focus a little bit on academic integrity before going into the details of research ethics and integrity. So, again, in academics, for those of us who are faculty members or will be faculty members, we need to promote honesty. We need to be fair. This fairness comes into our evaluation because you are continuously evaluating the students. So we need to be very fair. That's why these days we have a lot of rubrics which we need to follow. So you cannot just evaluate, especially the students, without any rubrics. And then there's the general responsibility which we have in terms of academic work. So that's why we will be called professionals. So following the timelines, and submitting whatever is required, and various other things, depending on which university or which institutes we are working for. So overall, it requires some honesty, and then a lot of fairness, and then responsibility in whatever work we are conducting. So overall, this will, as I mentioned, that the first thing that comes in mind is to avoid plagiarism. I'll be talking a little bit about the plagiarism aspect, but there is much more to that in terms of research as well as academic ethics. We need to properly cite. I'll be also talking about the citing and referencing. I think the researchers who are present in this session are already aware of citing as well as referencing. You have different types of citings like IEEE, ACM, and so on. It's very important to cite and reference the sources. Uh, Acknowledging the contribution of others. This is something which is very, very important. This also uh, brings into picture the, let's say, if you are publishing an article, the author's place in the line. Is it the first author, the second author, so on and so forth. So you acknowledge the contribution of the authors as well as acknowledge the contribution of others. So I will be touching upon that a little bit, and then whatever are the standards which are required in one's discipline. It could be from any background in terms of research, but whatever is the standard that is required uh, in one's discipline, I'll be touching upon that as well. So, why do we need this academic integrity? So, basically, we need to have a culture of trust and also honesty within the academic communities. So, we know nowadays that the academic community is coming very close to each other. They work very close with each other. It's not independent that two institutes or universities, do things stand alone. It's they work hand in hand. There's a lot of collaboration, especially in terms of research, which is going on, and we are always picking the best practices from different universities as well as different institutes. So, for this to happen, the particular institute or the university needs to build trust, so that others who are looking at them are sure that this, they can trust the processes which are happening within the university or the institute. There's also something which is known as intellectual honesty. I'll be touching upon that as we progress, and this is what creates the trust for the people who are looking at that particular university or the institute. So, in a summary, there's a long list of academic integrity, but I've just summarized it here. Uh, you basically need to have a strong foundation of your academics, as we always tell the students, especially when they come to the first year, that their basics need to be strong. So there needs to be a strong foundation on the academic as well as professional career. Uh, Once this is maintained, we can have good success in the academia and beyond. Always contributing to the advancement of knowledge. I think now everybody will agree that knowledge is not the same. We are always enhancing and advancing it. Of course, the basic remains the same, but we are always advancing the knowledge. Using different technology and different tools. So we always need to ensure that once we are adopting any of these tools or advanced technology, the results and the findings that we obtain are always reliable and trustworthy. A good example of this is using, let's say, AI or Gen AI for research. And now I think everybody knows that ChatGPT is being used a lot. So I'll be touching upon that as well, how good that is, or how I won't say bad, but how reliable it is, and where should we draw a line for using these technologies into our research. So overall, by using these technologies and tools, we should ensure that there is a contribution of the uh, knowledge. It is always extending the literature. It should not be another let's say article, for example, which just lies in the corner and just gives us one more publication. It should be used by a lot of people, cited by a lot of people. That's the whole purpose of why we are doing the or conducting the research. uh, of course, if we don't follow these ethics guidelines, there are going to be serious consequences. Uh, and these vary from institutes to institutes and universities. So, for students, especially in the foreign universities, this can lead to failing grades, where a lot of if you know, let's say, copy paste something, some sort of a homework or a project, and if you're found out, then this leads to failing grades, suspensions, and also even expulsion. So these are some of the consequences of academic misconduct. So we should be very sure that we are not falling here, and whatever results or whatever uh, work that we present is falling within the norms and the ethics of research, as well as the academic structure that is required. So there are the core ethical principles which I've already mentioned, like honesty, integrity, and the respect. Some of the key ones which are included. The first one is beneficence. It is basically to maximize the benefit of the research, and making sure that there is absolutely no harm to the participants or the society. So we cannot be doing any kind of research to get results which is harming the society or the individuals. So that is not an expense that we need to pay for, getting benefits in the research. So uh, when we are submitting any kind of research project or working on any kind of research project, this requires really careful design of the research, whatever is the methodology. And if those of us who are present in this session have done any kind of projects, submitted or completed any kind of projects, we are aware that there is always a clause where potential risks are asked, in any kind of project. So we need to ensure that these potential risks are already identified, and we also have some solutions in place in case these risks come out during the conduction of the project. The next one is non-maleficence, which basically is an obligation that we need to follow, which is to do no harm. So we must be taking all sorts of precautions to avoid any physical or psychological or any social harm to the participants or anybody involved in the research. Uh, for those of us who have already pursued a PhD, or those of us who are pursuing the PhD, we are already aware that uh, PhD also involves a lot of psychological aspects to it. Whether you are unmarried, married, or with a family, all those kind of things, working part time, full time. There's a lot of psychological aspects to the PhD. When do you want to complete your PhD, or when you want to start? There are different aspects. It has a lot of psychological background to it. So we must ensure that psychologically we are not harming the researchers who are involved in the project with us. Of course, there cannot be any physical issues as well. We cannot go into a fight over any kind of research. And also, the society in general should not be harmed you know, by the participants in that particular research. Next is justice. This is something which is very important, and something which I have experienced myself. Fairness and equity in research. Uh, so we must ensure that the burdens of research are distributed fairly, and we don't end up exploiting or excluding people who have contributed within the research project. So this is what I was mentioning, a few slides back that where do you place the authors. So usually the first author is the one who has done much of the work. Then you have the second author, so on and so forth. So if we have published or we are publishing in some journals, you will see observe these days that there is a clause towards the end where you also have to mention the contribution by different authors. And so there we can mention who conceptualized the research, who performed the simulation, who did the writing. So that is something where we are trying to ensure that everybody fairly gets what they deserve in the research, and there is equity in the research. So fairness and justice needs to be incorporated within the research. Next, of course, is very important, which is confidentiality. So one example that comes to my mind is if you're working in the domain of medicine, let's say biomedical, for example, then whatever data we collect needs to be very confidential because it's going to be patient's data. So we need to ensure that this is always maintained confidential, and it protects the privacy of those subjects from where we have taken the data. This was just one of the examples. There are also different examples where you must be having data from, let's say, some MNC or some government sector, because you're working on some projects by the government. So all that data needs to be very confidential. There is a data management system that we can use in our research. I will be highlighting that, and I believe that that would be helpful for the researchers who are present in this session. It has personally helped me a lot. So I will be talking about that in probably the next couple of slides. Next, of course, I've been talking about this is integrity. So we need to be accountable in whatever research we are doing, and it needs to be transparent. So there should not be anything hidden in whatever research we are trying to do. We should definitely avoid any conflict of interest. So this is a very common term that we come across, where uh, where we are always talking about you should not have any kind of conflict of interest with anybody involved in that research community. uh, so I'm just checking, sir, if I'm audible and the slides are visible.
Yes, everything is fine, sir. You're
Okay.
doing great. Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, yeah.
Go ahead.
So there is an aspect of why research ethics approval is necessary. There are many universities and institutes where you require this kind of approval. There are also research projects which we submit at different avenues where research ethics approval is required. It is basically to safeguard the participants in the research and also maintain the integrity of the research. So if you go into submitting any kind of research projects into different government sectors, for example, then this kind of research ethic approval is required. They have formats which the principal investigator and the co-principal investigator need to fill out, sign, and submit to ensure that these ethics are being followed, and these will be followed during the duration of the project. So you want to protect the participants in the research, be it the student, the PI, the co-PI, or any staff which we hire. You always want to protect them. You want to ensure that their rights and dignity is being maintained. Uh, if your research involves any animal subjects or community, then you ensure that their data as well as is protected and they are not harmed. So what is required in this case would be a consent from the subject, uh, and this needs to be informed uh, to maintain the confidentiality, the secrecy, and the privacy, and any potential harm or discomfort to the subjects. Next is to maintain the integrity by accurately reporting the results. There should not be any, tweak in the results to make sure that the project looks completed or it's on the right track. That should not be done. We should accurately report the results and always acknowledge the contribution of others, be it the PI, co-PI, any student staff who's involved in that particular research. Very important to comply with all the regulations. Different streams and disciplines of research will have their own regulation. Some of them would require legal and ethical frameworks. I would again take the example of medical. So in that case, we need to follow and comply with different regulations which are involved. Therefore, there should not be any issues, legally and ethically in one's research. Uh, Next is you always want to mitigate the risks which are involved. Uh, so, as I was mentioning before, for any project, we conduct the risk assessment. We, for that risk which we think could occur during the process or after the process, we implement a safety protocol, and have some rules and regulations to minimize and avoid those kind of risks if they come about, and also have some kind of plan uh, to manage any events which which we may not have seen when we were, let's say, submitting or writing that particular research project. Social responsibility again is very important in terms of our research. Most of the times, I mean, in my experience, we are so involved in let's say publishing our research or presenting our research that we don't really understand this social responsibility. It's very important to ensure that the research that we are presenting or putting out there, is having a good and quality impact on the research community in that discipline, so that this research is being used by others, or to extend what is already there in the literature. It should not be something which is just lying around. That is of no really use. So all the stakeholders which are who are involved in this particular research, they should be able to see the impact of the research that we are basically doing. So that comes under the umbrella of social responsibility, which we need to follow. So to ensure all of this which I have presented till now, there should be a thorough ethics approval process, which most of the universities are doing these days. There are different committees which are there already, which take care of this, which are on a day-to-day basis are seeing and observing and noting whether research projects are following these guidelines and ethics. Uh, Project funding avenues, are always doing that. Whether the projects which are submitted or projects which are ongoing have any kind of consequences like that. This is being taken very seriously. You know, it is suggested that we follow these guidelines and processes so that we are not under serious consequences later on. So we need to ensure that the participants, you know their well-being is guaranteed. uh, the integrity of the research is maintained, and whatever norms are to be followed, like laws and regulations, they are also being followed. So, as an individual, if you're not really sure, whether your project or the project you are working in requires any approval, always contact your supervisor or the project head. If you're working in a university or an institute, always contact the research ethics committee. It is now required to have such a committee within any university or institute, so that these things can be taken care of. I'll just highlight a little bit on the research ethics approval process, which is present in most of the benchmark universities. So during the project planning and design, you're expecting the researchers to identify any vulnerabilities, if there are any topics which are very sensitive, or if there are any potential conflict of interests that can come about. So this is something that we need to submit as a researcher during the initial phase of our project. Okay, so helps us in minimizing or first identifying and then minimizing the risks which could be there in the particular project. Then there is an application submission, the ethics application submission. Usually, this will involve outlining the objectives of the research, the methodology which is going to be used, any recruitment which we are going to do in terms of staff or let's say JRF or SRF, and then different consent procedures depending on the research which we are doing. Any data management plans, I will be highlighting this probably in the next slide or the slide after that. Data management plans and any risk mitigation strategies. So, most of the applications which we are submitting these days have this format, and it is very important for the person who is submitting these projects for funding to ensure that these things are being satisfied. Next comes the review after your application is submitted. So the ethics review committee is going to check whether there are any ethical implications of the research and ensure that the university's policy or the institute's policy and regulations are being met in this particular research project which is submitted. Based on this, the committee would provide you a feedback. The feedback could be as simple as approved. It could be, further information may be requested. In this case, we may have to revise and then submit the application. The last option could be a reject because your research would be addressing some or highlighting some real ethical concerns which are raised by the committee. So, based on these feedbacks, we need to revise or resubmit or work again on the projects which we are submitting. Then comes the amendments and the monitoring, which is what I mentioned. So during the course of the project as well, once it is approved and you are working on this research project, during this as well, the committee has the right to come and check whether the ethics are being followed in different lines. So, as I said, the committee is going to monitor the progress of the research throughout so that there is ethical compliance. So, whatever is the output of uh, whatever is the output of the project, it is always going to be, let's say, monitored by this ethics approval committee. Next comes something important which I wanted to share with all the participants here. Data, something very important in terms in our research. Uh, so this is based on my personal experience as well. How do you manage the data effectively? This involves how do you organize your data, how do you store it, and how do you ensure that this data follows the integrity and reusability of the data. So there must be a data management plan, because now with the new technologies we are always looking for data first. So there needs to be a data management plan because this plan will be a tool that will help us in handling the research data throughout the life cycle of our research. So even after you complete, let's say, a course like a master's or a PhD or a postdoctoral, the research continues, and so it is always good to have this data in place, and it's always good to have a plan to manage this data. So what basically is this DMP? It's a comprehensive document, not just as a file, but different folders, for example. It will describe how you will collect the data, if there is any processing involved of that data, then how would you store this data? Very important. And then most important is how will you share this data? Now, not all the data can be shared because you have maybe adopted the data from somewhere and it is only for private use. It could be your own data. So you may want to, let's say, for example, copyright that data and not share with everybody. You may want to charge for that data, as some MNCs do it. So depends how you want to share this data. Uh, at times, researchers just want to preserve this data; they don't want to share it. So you have different options, and the plan for the managing this data needs to be according to that. So this will serve as a roadmap and will ensure that this data is available over a long period. Long-term availability of the data can be ensured. So a well-structured DMP will help us in ensuring that the research is of high quality. It maintains the integrity and security of the data. It will help us in sharing the data. Let's say you complete a project and someone else joins that project. You can always share the data within the project batch, for example, and it will also help us in collaborating. Let's say two universities or institutes share this data, and the researchers then collaborate. Uh, the data now helps us in making the research visible. So I'm sure everyone is now aware of how this data is being shared, let's say on repositories like GitHub. Your data, or let's say the code is already available and you just adopt it with your own you know data, for example, and then run the code, for example, and then get your results. There are repositories, open access repositories, like I mentioned, archive, and different such repositories where you already have the research from top researchers available for reading even before they are published by the publishers. So there's a lot of data available. It helps us to view that data, view the research, and increases the impact of the research which is submitted on those repositories. So, what could be the key components of the DMP is how do you describe your data? Because once someone, let's say, goes to that, for example, website or the folder or that repository, how have you described the data? So if you just number the data or just alphabetize your data, it may not be meaningful to a lot of people. Then so it's very important to describe this data. How is this data being generated, and what is the size and the format? So is it of different, let's say, PDF, Excel, what is this format and what could be the expected size? How have you collected your data? It is always good to explain the method by which we have collected the data. Have you followed any ethical consideration and any data protection measures? It is very important because anybody who's adopting your data would always want to know if these things are being, if these have been followed before adopting your data. Something very important: how are you going to store and preserve this data? So we need to always address issues such as backup, security, and if this data is for long term, let's say you're working on a project which is a decade long, for example, then how are you going to preserve this data for such a long term? So this also is something which comes under the data management plan. Then next is very important: how are you going to share and access this data? So something which I already mentioned, examples would be GitHub, Archive, TechSquare. There are different kinds of repositories there. And how are you going to provide or share, and how are people going to access this? So for those of us who are aware of this, let's say for example, in Archive, we always go for different kinds of licensing. So there is a license which is known as Creative Commons license. So most of that helps the authors to have all the rights, whereas it gives the right to the person who is wanting to read your research, read it and then also share that with others. So there are different kinds of licensings if you go on Archive or different repositories. How are you going to document the data, and how are you going to create the metadata for the data? So metadata is nothing but the data about the data. So how are you naming the data, and then what is the data for that particular data? So all these things have to be maintained. How are you going to document it? So this is very important. It's become now one of the key aspects of research, the data and how to manage this data. So, but in doing all of this, we need to ensure that the ethics and the integrity is maintained. For all these data, like the research, are there any ethical and legal considerations? If your data involves taking any personal contacts, any personal data, then we need to ensure that consent is there from the people, privacy and confidentiality is maintained. Uh, the person taking this data, storing this data, will be absolutely responsible for storing this data and also sharing this data. So that needs to be ensured. So how do you create your DMP? This is something which I'm sharing from my experience. I started developing my DMP very early in my research. So I had my folders and everything intact. And as I moved on with the research, I could create my own DMP. Now I have a very large data repository with me. Uh, I personally share this also on GitHub as well as on different repositories like Archive. So you'll find a lot of my research which is available on Archive even before it is published by different publishers. It helps increase the impact of my research in terms that many people are able to read my research well before it is published. Of course, after it is published, there are changes to that research, but in general, all the core of the research remains the same. So if you're not really sure about the DMP, always contact your supervisor. You know, if your supervisor is aware of this DMP, any colleagues or at many places the library helps you in creating this DMP. Uh, there are many funders as well as different institutions who provide templates. But in my experience, you don't need to adopt any template. You will create your own DMP in your own research because research for different people is different and the way we conduct research is also different. So it's best to create your own data management or manage your data, with experience. So overall, this DMP will be a document which going to be updated, as we go ahead in research. So this will always be updated. Next is, as I was mentioning about the data protection and security in research. So we need to be very sure if any personal data is being collected, this data protection is maintained there. Uh, Key principles which I would like to highlight is the first one is the purpose limitation. We should be very sure for what purpose we are taking this data. So it's not just that we should just keep collecting this data and not be sure why we are doing it. So the purpose needs to be we need to be very sure of the purpose, and based on that, we need to collect the exact data. Only take that data which is required. No, it's not necessary to take all the data. You know, just as an example, if you want to know, let's say, the age of the person, there is no requirement to get the height of the person, for example. So just get the data which is required for that particular research which we are conducting. Uh, Ensure the accuracy and update the personal data as it comes from the people who are giving it to you. Storage is to be important. We need to have a clear idea of how much data we are going to be collecting, and what is the storage that would be required. So that is something that, as a researcher, we should be aware of. And again, lastly, the integrity and confidentiality needs to be maintained. We cannot just be sharing this personal data with everybody. So that needs to be only within that particular research group. So there are different security measures. I'm just highlighting or summarizing the key ones. One is to secure the storage. So I'm sure everybody is aware of this. You can have the password protected files. If you're using some devices like hard drive, always encrypt them. Limit the access to only those who are authorized. So access controls can be implemented so that not everybody has access to the data. Regularly back up your data so that you're not losing out on any data. You can always have anonymity of the data. Uh, you can also name it, have a pseudonames to it, so that participant privacy is maintained. And data transfer is very important. Use only secure methods for transferring. Uh, I would suggest using, let's say, platforms like WhatsApp is not a good idea. So always have encrypted FTPs so that nobody is losing out on that data and that remains within the project. So overall, by having these measures, we can ensure that you know we are following the ethics and any legalities which are involved in the research data. Uh, by doing this consistently, we can ensure that the participant who is helping us out with the data uh, has built trust with us, so that in your future project he is able to give you more data which is required, and of course your research is also maintaining the integrity which is required. So I just want to highlight key terms. The ones in the red are something which I think most of us would be aware of, because these are some of the terms which come in mostly journals that we submit to. So you will always have to give a data availability statement uh, describing how, or how was it that this particular data has supported your research. There are some where data availability is not applicable, but that most as we see today, data is available. So how do you make this data available to others? DOI, I think everybody is aware of that. It's a string digital object identifier, which gives you a link to your draft, the article, so that it can be cited and used for future purpose. ORCID, which is Open Researcher and Contributor ID. I strongly suggest the beginner researchers to have ORCID ID. It's very helpful. My personal experience with ORCID has been very good. It directly connects your articles or whatever you do, whatever work you do, directly to this ID, so that you have all of this stored within this one ID. So you don't have to go back and forth to supply any data to different places within your university, within your institute, or anywhere. So one ORCID ID will help you in you know getting all the, the works which you have done, include anything in the research. So it is strongly suggested to have an ORCID ID. uh, Personal data, pseudonym data, research data, these are some of the aspects which we can use. A lot of researchers are now using it, especially pseudonyms for the data, so that it is not being lost. uh, and any personal data if we have, we need to be very sure of. Next comes an important aspect. So I just want to uh, talk about it in a lighter term. So whenever we start the process of writing, usually before writing, we are always very sure of what we are going to do. So this picture tells us that how we are, sitting tight with, you know, our muscles are activated, and we just know exactly what we are going to write. We have all the words in our mind, but then as we proceed in writing, usually we are confused. Panic comes in, uh, and then once that happens, you are kind of demotivated. You are hesitant to write. So usually people go for a vacation, they don't want to write, or usually you would want to take help. So why am I talking about this writing aspect? So when things like demotivation or panic or hesitation in writing comes into the picture, we look for what are known as, I would say, shortcuts, and that leads to something which is not a good thing, which is plagiarism. So you're basically copy pasting from some source, uh, paraphrasing something without attributing to them or without referencing to them, using an idea which is not yours, and someone else's, and then not acknowledging them. This is all related to IP, which is, I'm sure everyone knows, intellectual property, which is basically the creation of minds. You can have any inventions or any artistic work, design simple, which is not ours, which is someone else's. So if you want to use that, then we need to reference the person or the people who have done it. We need to credit them. When we don't do that, that is what is known as plagiarism. So it's an offense, and it has its own consequences. I've already highlighted this before. For a student, in many places, it leads to failing grades, uh, expulsion, and those kind of things. So we should really avoid. This is seen a lot in the research that we conduct, and as a reviewer, as editors, we find this a lot, and so it's not a good practice. There are softwares for it. I'm sure everyone is aware of. There are softwares like Turnitin, Authenticate, to find out. There are also ways to find out if ideas or concepts have been, uh, you know, uh, pulled up without crediting, and so that is known as patent landscaping. For those of us who are involved in the patents copyrights would be aware of this term. So overall, it's not a good practice. Always reference from where we have adopted something. Always give provide citations. Credit the people, the authors who have used that. There are different referencings which are available, like IEEE, Howard, APA. There are different ones depending on the domain we are from. So which is applicable to your domain would be something that your supervisor will help you out with. Or when you read the articles or different documents, you'll be aware of that. So make sure that you don't get into this practice. Take your time. Make sure that everything that you put out is yours or your research groups. So some of the key terms I wanted to highlight. One is copyright. Uh, so as researchers, we always need to respect this copyright when we are using someone else's work. So that proper citation and permission needs to be given. So, for example, if you are writing a book and you need to adopt some figures, let's say which is available in some other book, for example, we need to take permission from the author and the publisher in that case. Once that is provided, you can always adopt it, but then you also need to give credit to that particular author and the publisher. So that's required. Just can't adopt it as it is, cannot change it slightly and then present it as our own because the idea is someone else's. So we need to be very clear with this. As I was mentioning before, there's something which is known as a license. So I'm highlighting here Creative Commons license. For those of us who do this preprint, a lot, will be used to this Common license. So most of the researchers work under this license, and they must adhere to this particular license. So you can always read the details of this CCL license. It allows the creators, the researcher, to share their work, uh, and you retain some of the rights from it. A fair dealing has to be ensured, so that copyrighted material is used in the work, but you ensure that it is being fairly and proportionately used. You don't just take everything which is available and then try to present it as your own. So, open access is another aspect where we need to focus on. There's a very fine line between open access here. There you would have heard about open access fee as well. So we need to be very sure about this open access, especially in terms of articles, journals. Make sure that the ethical principle is being followed when we are talking about this open access. I've already mentioned about licensing and intellectual property. Licensing is very important. You can read a lot about different kinds of licensing if you are interested in posting about your research as a preprint. Then there are different licenses which are available. So I've already touched upon plagiarism, public domain. This is one thing that I was talking about in terms of preprints, repositories. The last aspect which I really want to cover is this use of AI in our research. This is being used a lot. There's a lot of generative AI which is being used. Uh, in my opinion, we should have uh, committees which are following up on the use of this generative AIs in terms of research, because what can be used and what cannot be used from generative AI into our research is very important. A lot of times, which I am now observing, is that uh, researchers are not really aware of what to adopt from generative AI and what to leave out. So what comes out as a final product may not be something which is ethical. So we need to be really aware of using this generative AI into our research. So from those of us who are from the AI background, we must be aware of this idea of accuracy and bias. So there's a lot of critical evaluation which is required by the researcher. If you are trying to include any AI generated content within your research, make sure that accuracy and fairness is maintained in your research. Uh, make sure that there's a lot of transparency, and you also acknowledge the use of this AI tool within your research. There's a lot of chat GPT being used. We are all aware of that, but how much of it is being acknowledged in someone's research, that only needs to be evaluated by the committees. So uh, be very transparent and acknowledge the use of generative AI or any AI tool, into your research. Again, privacy and data protection comes into the picture, because you know that AI works on a lot of data. So we need to handle this data with utmost care, a lot of responsibility, compliance with the regulations and the rules. And if any consent is required, then that also needs to be followed. There's a lot of talk about intellectual property when it comes to generative AI. We also need to make sure that we are aware of any rights which are required to use the AI generated content, and in doing so, we are not infringing on the rights of others. So that is something important that we need to ensure when we are using any generative AI content within our research. This is something which is, I believe, kind of debatable, in the sense that human oversight. Uh, Always make sure how much of generative AI you want to use, and how much of human uh, interference and inference is required within your research. You always need to have human judgment and critical thinking within the research. This is my personal experience. So, all in all, we cannot leave everything to generative AI within our research, because after all, it is us who are creating generative AI. So, there needs to be human judgment and critical thinking on that. So I believe as of now, at any university or institute, there must be serious guidance on what is acceptable and what is the responsible use of generative AI in the research. We just cannot blindly go and use any AI tool and just incorporate whatever is there, into our research and write it and present it. These days, even presentations are being made by ChatGPT. We are all aware of that. So we need to evaluate it. We need to see how much of the ethics is being followed. So, I believe that since it is at an initial stage, at any university, at any institute, we need to have some guidance on what is acceptable and what is the responsible use of this AI. So I think there should be an ethics approval which is required, so that you are sufficiently telling or putting out how much of generative AI will be used in your particular research and what is the consequence of that. Uh, Peer review, I strongly believe you cannot use generative AI for peer review. It will definitely lead to confidentiality and intellectual property issues. Peer review has to be done by reviewers. Uh, so can't use generative AI for peer review. Authorship, again, generative AI should not be listed as an author. I think nobody does that, but I just wanted to put it out. Uh, no one would probably do that as well, but you can't have generative AI as one of the authors in whatever you're trying to do. So we need to ensure that generative AI is used as much, so that it ensures the integrity, the validity, and whatever ethics are required within our research. It is not, exceeding uh, what is not required. It can have its own serious consequences. So there are some key points which I wanted to put out in terms of generative AI. Bias, I think the AI background participants here will be really aware of that AI does have a prejudice depending on the data which we are providing or the algorithm which we use, and this can seriously lead to a lot of unfair outcomes. So we need to be very sure of that. Uh, Generative AI, this will allow your machine to create new content, including text, image, video. There's a lot more, including codes. So we need to be very sure whether, whether we want to use generative AI. If so, then how much of it needs to be used. Uh, there are also cases where large language models (LLMs) are being used now. They produce the text outputs, so researchers are using them. Of course, we need to be very sure how much of it to be used. Uh, Overall, I believe that a lot of transparency is required in terms of using all the tools and all these mechanisms, so that we are very open about our research, and a lot of honesty is being followed, the ethics is being followed. So I would say AI tools are good to go, but not at the expense of uh, the ethics and the integrity which we need to have. There definitely will always be the human touch or human interference in the research. It needs to be. So we need to evaluate the use of AI within our research. So the next part is the last part, which I wanted to highlight, is the metrics which are used to uh, evaluate research. Uh, so I'm a strong believer that peer review will always remain essential. We cannot do away with peer review. So your expert assessment will always be there. Of course, this is very debatable, but the peer review will always remain there. It will be one of the key responsible and key metric to evaluate any research at any place. Uh, Metrics which are relevant should only be used to evaluate the research, have specific goals and objectives. We can't use the same metric for all the research. So the committee or the people who are involved in evaluating the research must ensure that the same metrics are not being used. It can lead to unfair results in that case. Again, transparency, openness. We should always allow the researchers to verify the data and analyze the data, and this needs to be further, in turn, being openly presented to everybody. Uh, if there are any disciplinary variations, we should not be using metrics to, which are unfair or provide some advantage to a certain set of researchers and disadvantage to certain set of researchers. So, evaluating these metrics and how to use them itself is an evaluation that we need to do. So we can't just, for example, we can't just say, okay, I'm going to use H index for everybody or I-10 for everybody, or impact factor for everybody, because we are aware that impact factors will be different for different disciplines. So we need to have a good analysis of what metrics we are going to use to, judge or evaluate the research progress of the researchers. So. We should always evaluate the researchers, this is my opinion, on the overall progress which the researcher has made, not just on a single particular metric. This is exactly what I was telling you. Uh, Also, I believe that we should not rely a lot just on the metrics. There are cases where metrics can be built by other ways. So it's not just, we should not just over rely on the metrics, or the decisions of the funding agency and so on and so forth. There needs to be some proper analysis done here. I think the metrics themselves need to be reviewed and updated, especially when now that preprint has come into the picture, and also open reviews have come into the picture. So I'm sure everyone is aware that now you can also get the reviews of your article openly on an open forum. So with all this coming up, I think it's time for us to update the metrics regularly, so that we can evaluate the research much better. So that's all from my side in terms of ethics and integrity for research. Uh, Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or on ResearchGate. In terms of research, my current focus is on wireless systems. So I'm working on two aspects. One is known as semantic communications. The other one is spectrum enhancement. And I work with intelligent wireless systems. So there's a little bit of AI, but most of it is mathematical in nature. So feel free to connect with me, and there's a lot of collaborative work which we are open to. Uh, so that's all from my side. If there is any point of discussion, question, I'll be happy to interact.